Okay, so before we start, I'll just go through some virtual engagement guidelines. So we're trying to avoid Zoom bombing, which if you haven't heard of, consider yourself lucky. So we'll be keeping everyone muted and your video off to conserve bandwidth and keep the focus on the speaker. We encourage you to view this presentation. We have some really amazing photos John pulled in speaker view, which is at the bottom of your screen. For some, it's on the top right to get full screen. And then if you have a question throughout the presentation, and we'll also have a Q&A at the end, feel free to open the chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you're on mobile, it's a little different, but you should be able to find this little messenger box. And you can send a question and it'll come to me, and I'll ask it of the group later. So that's it for this slide. So my name is Nikki. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance, and we're a nonprofit based currently in Anchorage. We were founded in 1978, which is pretty old for Alaska. That became a state not much before. And we're committed to the protection of Alaska's wildlife. We advocate for healthy ecosystems, which are ethically and scientifically managed. And we have a few different programs, community-based programs, and Wildlife Wednesdays is a continuous program we run year-round to educate people about wildlife issues in their backyard and across the state. And so we've had them in person in Juneau, Soldotna, and Anchorage, but we've turned remote given everything that's going on. So I think that's this slide. Thanks, John. You can join our newsletter online at our website, akwildlife.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, where we post a lot of our advocacy opportunities, education, and every once in a while we have to put something lighthearted on there to make sure we keep a smile on, so we have some wildlife fun. But give us a follow on Facebook and social media if you'd like to stay up to date. And we record our Wildlife Wednesdays, so if you hear this presentation and want to share it with someone, or if you've missed some of our previous or future Wildlife Wednesdays, you can find them on our website. You can see a list of our previous talks. We also have a teaser documentary about the Denali Wolf project that we're working on. And then next month, we have a presentation about drone footage recording how humpback whales work smarter, not harder, to bubble feed. There's some really cool footage with Madison Cosma. And then September 2nd, we have avian influenza in the seabirds of Beringia, which is going to be really cool too. So stay tuned on that. Great, and so I wanted to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. John Morton. He doesn't like, we'll say John, was the supervisory biologist at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge for 17 years before he just retired in 2019. He's worked on a number of wildlife refuges, including Arctic, Yukon Delta, Guam, and he's now on the board of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance as our vice president. So we're really lucky to have John, and he's a wealth of knowledge. So I'm going to turn the floor over to him. Thanks, John.
Okay, thanks. You can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
So this is a little tedious, but I've got lots and lots of pictures to keep people entertained, so that'll be good. There's some background here that this is kind of setting up what this is all about, all these management changes. And there's a little bit of history here. I just want to take the time to explain it so you kind of understand the context which this is all happening. So basically in the in the mid 2000s, the Kenai Refuge, National Wildlife Refuge, the staff there revised their comprehensive conservation plan. And this is, the strategic working plan for the refuge. And the original one was done in 1985. This was published in 2010, and it was a very long process. It took several years. There was a lot of public scoping and public meetings, and out of that came a regulation package that was published officially in 2016 in the Code of Federal Register. So now these are now regulations that came out of some of the management changes that were decided in this comprehensive conservation plan. Well, the following year, a lawsuit was filed by the state of Alaska and Safari Club International trying to roll back these regulations. And it's not, it's not coincidental that this occurred with the change in national administration. And of course, that lawsuit was filed against the Department of Interior. And keep in mind that the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge is within the agency of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is within the Department of Interior. So essentially they were suing the refuge, but of course the lawsuit went against the Department of Interior. And then just this year, just as of early June, the Department of Interior, to kind of appease the state and Safari Club International, issued this, put out this proposed, what we call the Kenai Rule. And it's a different regulation package as opposed to what was proposed in 2016. And this is a very unusual step because normally the Department of Interior would support the refuge and fight this out in court. So this was put out. And so one of the reasons why I'm presenting it as opposed to say a current refuge employee is that the refuge is not really part of this proposed rule. That's kind of the Department of Interior is kind of stepping around the refuge, which in and of itself is a very unusual turn of events. So I got to back up a little bit here, and so I'm going to kind of break this up into. I'm going to try to go fast at the beginning here and kind of give you a little history on the refuge because it's a great story. I mean, the refuge has been around for 80 years. And it's a long, it's an old refuge, and kind of get you appreciate what the refuge does and what it's all about, and really appreciate how beautiful it is, and then talk about how these regulations impact you. So for anybody who's from Alaska, I think most people know this, that the Kenai National Moose Range was established in 1941. In fact, within a week of when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, and it was established in 1941, and this is well before statehood. So the refuge has been around, almost 20 years before statehood actually occurred. At that time, though, it was called the National Moose Range, and it was supposed to support what was considered at that time to be a subspecies of moose, the Giant Kenai moose. But of course, that's long since we realize now that that's not the case at all. It's just they were just big mooses. So here's the refuge on the left, and it's the, Kenai Refuge is 2 million acres on the 6 million acre Kenai Peninsula. And the light green there is the refuge. That's the 2 million acres. And I don't know if you can see the hatch mark very well, but the hatch mark, the diagonal marks indicate the Kenai wilderness. So 2/3 of the refuge, or 1.3 million acres, is congressionally designated wilderness. And what happened in 1980, basically what happened in 1980, and you see up above there, it used to be called the Kenai National Moose Range. In 1980, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act changed the name of the refuge from the Moose Range to the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. And it didn't just change the name, it actually added some land into the refuge, but it also created new purposes for the refuge, and this is what they are. And you can read them on your own, but basically the two primary ones, and these are true for all refuges in Alaska, is to conserve fish and wildlife populations and habitats in their natural diversity, including but not limited to a suite of species. And that suite of species changes a little bit for each of the different refuges in Alaska. We're being tasked, the refuge is tasked with fulfilling international fish and wildlife treaty obligations. And then as long as these two primary, we call these the primary purposes, are held up, there are other sub-purposes underneath that, including compatible fish and wildlife oriented recreation. So fish and wildlife oriented recreation in this case does include hunting and fishing, hiking, wildlife viewing, you know, boating, all of the above. So there's a few things I want to point out in yellow here. Hopefully you guys are seeing this. One is we are tasked with conserving natural diversity, and we're specifically tasked with conserving bears, and that's brown and black bears, and wolves and other fur bearers. And you'll see very shortly that some of the regulations that are being changed affect both of these groups of species, both bears and fur bearers. The other thing is that it's a strange regulation package because it also is mixing in, along with hunting and fishing changes, harvest changes, it's also being, it's mixing in some impacts on other kinds of recreation, non-consumptive recreation, which is, you know, wildlife viewing and boating, and you'll see that shortly too. So it's definitely stepping on the purposes of the refuge. That's what's so weird about this DOI package. There's other refuge purposes as well, because we have other federal legislation that falls on us. And I mentioned to you earlier that 2/3 of the refuge is congressional wilderness. And so the 1964 Wilderness Act applies, and we have to uphold those wilderness standards. And then the Organic Act for the National Wildlife Refuge system is 1997. It's called the Refuge Improvement Act. And it says in there, other things being equal, we have to support our primary purposes. But other things being equal, we also have to ensure the biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health of the refuge systems. In this case, systems being ecological systems. So there's a lot of local folks here, and then there's a few folks from outside of Alaska who may not have ever been up here to the Kenai Refuge. And even those who live locally sometimes don't often get off the road system. So I just want to remind you what the 2 million acre refuge actually protects. And so you're supposed to, you know, appreciate this. Everybody knows what this is. This is Ski Lac Lake, looking up towards the Kenai Mountains. This is looking out over the Kenai lowlands, which is, you know, pretty spectacular moose and bear habitat. This is looking out, this is the northern end of the refuge where it touches down into salt water. This is Chickaloon Flats, which is the largest estuary on the Kenai Peninsula, and is the only place that we actually touch salt water, or the refuge touches salt water. I'm sorry, I'm going to occasionally say we, because I only retired from the refuge 6 months ago, and after, you know, being there for 17 or 18 years, it's still hard for me to break the pattern of talking, you know, about the refuge as if I work on it still. Lots of beautiful places like this on the refuge are all over the place. Same thing here. And of course, we have lots of nice wildlife. We have things like caribou. And of course, even a lot of locals don't really appreciate that caribou were actually, the endemic subspecies of caribou was actually extirpated back around I think it was around 1917, that's 17, or 1918. And the caribou has since been reintroduced by both the refuge and the Alaska Department of Fish and Wildlife back in the 60s, and then again in the 80s. Of course, we've got lots of moose, and that's why we once were called the Kenai National Moose Range. This is just a shot of some of the seabird colonies out in Ski Lac Lake. So we're looking at double-crested cormorants here. This is out on the Chickaloon Flats that I mentioned earlier that sticks out. You know, it's an estuary, salt marsh. And of course, the iconic brown bear in the salmon stream. That's what everybody likes to see. Even if you're out there fishing close, it's pretty nice. The problem, though, is that the refuge is also Alaska's version of an urban refuge. We're the only other refuge besides us, Tetland Refuge. We're the only other refuge. There's only 2 of us that are on the road system. And of course, being so close to Anchorage, the Kenai gets the brunt of tourism, both from the cruise industry as well as people flying into Anchorage. And then it gets all the folks that live up in Anchorage like to come down here and fish, which they're doing right now. And it very much is an urbanizing landscape. So over in the lower left, you see cars coming down the Sterling Highway, and it looks kind of like that right now. And the annual traffic load on there is 1.2 million acres, I'm sorry, 1.6 million vehicles a year are coming down the Sterling Highway, which cuts right across the Kenai Refuge. A lot of people don't appreciate that the discovery well for oil for the state of Alaska, it's what made Alaska a state, is on the Kenai Refuge, 1957. And we have 14,000 acres of leased lands on the refuge are up for commercial oil and gas development and has been there for years. And then, you know, the other piece is that we have this urbanizing landscape with over 50,000 residents and several communities that are all around the boundary of the refuge. And it really is creating this issue for the refuge because it's very difficult for the refuge to manage things like wildfire, for instance, or invasive species. Lots of visitors because it is a nice place. And as I mentioned, it's very close to Anchorage and where all the tourists come in. Lots of activity. The upper pictures, obviously the Russian River fisheries. And to accommodate all this, the refuge has more, I think this is a true statement. This is the way I remember it. The Kenai Refuge has more miles of trails than all the rest of the refuges in the country put together. So, you know, there's 29 trailheads, 250 miles of trails, 13 campgrounds, and then 2 large wilderness canoe systems, the Swan Lake and the Swanson River canoe systems. There's 16 public use cabins, 14 of which are on the reservation system, so people can just pay to get on, and 2 of them are whoever gets there first gets to use them. There's, you know, and because there's a lot of activity, there's 200 commercial visitor services permits issued by the refuge. The Kenai Refuge has the largest law enforcement division of any refuge in the country. I think we have half dozen LE people on staff right now. And then there's a lot of environmental education and outreach. We have a really nice education center, and there's this camp on the right is some kind of a wildlife law enforcement camp for kids who are interested in going into that field. And then, of course, the refuge maintains a large visitor center on Ski Hill Road here locally in Soldotna. Those are all the sort of the public use end of the business, but obviously there's a lot of management that occurs on the refuge as well. And fire management is huge. This is the last year's big fire that burned 170,000 acres. And you can kind of get a sense of the scope of the fire because you can see the highway down there. And of course, what you see up on top of the photo there is the rotor of a helicopter. So it's a helicopter that's flying over, looking down. And you get a sense of how big the Swan Lake fire was. It was enormous and very threatening to Cooper Landing and Soldotna and Sterling and even Fundy River to a certain extent. And the refuge does a lot of active management and restoration. Has a long history of it. I mentioned earlier that you know, caribou were reintroduced after they were extirpated, and that's what you see sticking out of the slots of the helicopter. There are heads of caribou that were darted from the Nelchina herd, and they've got face coverings on so they're not as perturbed by being in a helicopter, but they're literally being carried over from the Nelchina herd to the Kenai Refuge to be released. Over on the left there, lower left, that's restoration in I think that was the late 90s at Jim's Landing for, you know, after a big flood on the Kenai River. We put in a lot of fish passage culverts, and back in the 60s and 70s when this place was still called the Kenai National Moose Range, there was a lot of big habitat manipulation with these big tree crushers that went across the landscape to create moose habitat. Nowadays, we do a lot of invasive plant management. We put down, I say this sadly, we put down, or the refuge puts down more herbicide than probably all other federal land units in Alaska combined, both aquatic and terrestrial. Just recently, we completed this wildlife mitigation package on the Sterling Highway that was recently improved. You know, anybody who lives here locally, it's now a pretty fast drive, and it's got quite a few passing lanes now, but underneath it, unbeknownst to a lot of people, there's 6 big wildlife underpasses, including a new bridge over the East Fork of the Moose River. And that's what you see down there in the lower picture. That's a camera, remote camera capturing a moose going underneath the bridge this past winter. So it's nice to know they're working. We do a lot of wildlife research, long history of it. I just showed a couple of fun pictures. The one on the left is actually back from the 70s and 80s when there was a lot of trumpeter swan research. And then here you see a helicopter coming in with a guy darting mountain goats. And this is really recently. This was just from a year or two ago up in the Kenai Mountains. And the big deal here, the part I hope you appreciate, is that there's a lot of activity here, and we've got a lot of different mandates, and we have a lot of different issues, and we have a lot of different user groups. And it's the job of the refuge manager to balance all of these different, sometimes conflicting mandates and issues, and obviously very different user groups depending on, we have urban user groups, we have people who love to hunt and fish, we have people who want to canoe, we have people that want to run motorboats and skis if they could get them in there. So lots of different pieces, and that's why the proposed Kenai Rule that's coming from the Department of Interior is kind of strange, because it's definitely stepping on the toes of the refuge's ability to manage all of these competing, some of these competing mandates. And so I'll just kind of run through it, but that's kind of the background of what's going on here. And if you're local, some of the proposals actually are kind of nice. There's actually a few of these things that I'm kind of like excited about, and I won't tell you which ones, but it typically involves riding a bicycle. But there's a few in here that I actually like, but there's some in here that are really egregious and I really don't like. And so one of the comments I want to make to you right now before I forget is that I hope everybody here submits comments. And if you do submit comments, it's not an all or nothing. I mean, in other words, if you don't have to like all of the rule, and you don't have to dislike all of the rule. It's okay to like some of it and okay to dislike some of it. And you just have to be very clear when you write in your comments which ones you're offended by and which ones you're not. So this is one half of what the Kenai Rule proposes. I'll show you some slides to kind of illustrate what's going on to follow up, but pretty quickly, the first, it's saying on the upper Kenai and the Russian River is to allow seasonal firearm discharge within a quarter mile of those two stream bodies. Right now, what happened was in 2016, when the refuge put out its regulatory package, it changed it from an open season to a completely closed season within that quarter mile stretch. This new proposed Kenai Rule is bumping it back so that it'll be closed from November 1 to, open from November 1 to April 30th. And I'll tell you something more about that shortly. It also allows, the rule proposes to allow bicycles on 137 miles of trails, roads, and right-of-ways on designated trails and lakes. And right now, without this rule, there are no bicycles allowed on the Kenai Refuge other than on roads. The rule proposes to allow game carts on designated roads and right-of-ways. It proposes to allow ATVs and UTVs and snow machines wherever automobiles are already allowed on lakes for ice fishing. And it proposes to allow brown bear take or harvest over bait in a 200 miles square permitted area on the Kenai lowlands. So let me just show you a few slides to show you the details of what some of that looks like. So the first one is to allow seasonal firearm discharge within a quarter mile of the upper Kenai and Russian River. And this is, again, during the winter months from November 1 to, well, not winter, but really from the shoulder seasons on either side, from November 1 to April 30th. And in principle, it's not a great big deal because it's not a high use time for other activities, but it still is going to be a concern. The rafting season is getting longer and longer as our climate warms. And I specifically took this photo off the Alaska Tour and Travel, just to remind people that you know, it is a commercial enterprise. People do make money off of this kind of rafting. And what this particular regulation proposes is that waterfowl hunting is still allowed. You can still carry a firearm for bear protection, so it's not affecting any of that. They just don't want high-powered rifles, you know, within the immediate river corridor, and that's basically to protect people who are stopping to use, you know, people. I'm talking rafters and wildlife viewers and fishermen that are along the river. The other thing that's a little disturbing as a biologist about this is that you've got these bears that have learned to coexist, you know, along the river with fishermen, and then all of a sudden, come November 1, it's open season, and so that to me is a little disturbing. You know, you've got these bears that are starting to work with people, and now we're going to remove them. Another one is to allow bicycles on 137 miles of trail roads and right-of-ways. And I don't know if some of you people might recognize the woman up in the right. She's from Homer. She's a very, very serious mountain biker, and you can see her there with her fat tire bikes. I want to clarify that the bike regulation, proposed bike regulation here, is to keep it on specific trails. It's not going to be open cycling. It's not like you're going to be able to get out and ride out across, you know, alpine tundra. It's only on certain designated trails. And for those that are local, you can see the list on the side there. We're talking about Mystery Creek Road and the N-Star Pipeline right away. We're talking Wolf Lake Road, Moose Research Center Road, which is at the end of the Swanson River Road, the Woodcut Road, which is on Funny River, the Marsh Lake Trail, the Ski Hill Trail, which is actually being built right now, and then 6 lakes in the Ski Lac Wildlife area. When the lakes are frozen, you can ride on the lake. And that's Botany, Kelly, Peterson, Marsh, Engineer, and Hidden Lake. Game carts. Game carts actually are allowed right now on industrial roads, and all this is proposing to do, I'm sorry, industrial roads within the, you know, I mentioned earlier that there's 14,000 acres of commercial oil and gas development. And so this just kind of expands that. So in addition to being able to use game carts on industrial roads in those 2 fields, you'll also be able to use it on selected right-of-ways and roads. So the Mystery Creek Road, N-Star Pipeline right-of-way, the Moose Research Center Road, Woodcut Road, and various utility right-of-ways. So that's not too big of a deal. The only reason why game carts is a big deal on the refuge, I just want to mention that as sort of a side note, is that they're not typically allowed in wilderness. And again, 2/3 of the refuge is congressionally designated wilderness. But that also means that there's a bunch of land outside of wilderness that this is being allowed on. This is one of the stickier ones here, and I hope you pay attention here. And this regulation package offers to allow brown bear harvest over bait. And in this instance, it's not just anywhere, it's specifically on areas that are currently permitted for black bear baiting. And so in the map there, it's everything on the right, or everything in orange on that map on the right. And it's an area that's about 200 miles square. So it's a pretty large area. And you can see it kind of abuts Nikiski, Kenai, Soldotna, and Sterling, as well as it bumps up against the Swanson oil and gas field, which is kind of that squiggly line in red, which is where all the roads are. At any rate, it's being superimposed on this area that's already permitted for black bear sites. And the way it's currently managed is that this 200 square mile area is divided up into 1 mile square permitted blocks. So a permitted bear baiter would be allowed within a 1 square mile block of the 200 mile square area. So this is where I think it's kind of a big deal. You know, the difference between black bear baiting and brown bear baiting is pretty substantive, because most black bear that are taken over bait are eaten. Lots of people like to eat black bears. They swear by it. The difference with brown bears is nobody eats them. And then in 2016, the board, during the regulatory season of 2016, the Board of Game made it a little bit easier for people to kill bears because they eliminated the previous requirement to used to be that you had to salvage the meat from brown bear, and now or the carcass, and in this case it's no longer the case. They did away with that. So basically anybody who's shooting a brown bear over bait on the Kenai Refuge is doing it essentially for trophy. They're either going after the hide, the skull, the claws, whatever. They're not going after it for meat. And I'm not questioning whether this is a good thing or a bad thing somewhere else. My question is, should this kind of activity be happening on a national wildlife refuge? And I hope you think the answer is no. I just don't think this should be occurring. Another aspect of this is another real photo. This is a black bear baiting station. And what you have, of course, is 3 brown bear cubs down there poking around. And the real obvious question is, are we creating a generation of bears that are being conditioned to want to go after human food? And that's kind of a concern, because I kind of showed you that 200 square mile area is kind of buffered up. It's kind of pushing up against towns, and it's pushing up against relatively high recreation use areas like the canoe system and the Swanson River Road. The other thing that the Kenai Rule proposes to do is to eliminate the existing refuge furbearer trapping program. And this is one that they don't, the Department of Interior did a very poor job within the draft environmental assessment that they did for this proposed rule. They did a very bad job explaining. In fact, they really didn't explain what this meant. And basically, the refuge program, what the refuge program currently does is that it puts in a bunch of safeguards, and these are safeguards for non-target species, and they're safeguards for people, for other users. And this trapping program came out of a very contentious public scoping process way back in the 80s, right after ANILCA was passed. And it came to a head in 1988 when the furbearer management plan was developed for the refuge. And out of that furbearer management plan came this trapping program. And what the trapping program does is everybody who traps on the refuge has to register with the refuge. And then there are slightly tighter regulations imposed by being a permitted trapper on the refuge than you would if you were trapping under state regulations. So what the Kenai Rule is doing is it's removing the furbearer trapping program that the refuge has in place to allow the much more relaxed regulations that the state has to basically to take over the way things are managed on the refuge. And so see, these is quickly some of the details there. One of them, the current trapping program requires a one-time trapper orientation class for all permitted trappers. It's a one-day workshop, and in that you learn, about ethics and about the regulations, and make sure that a lot of inexperienced trappers actually understand what the responsibilities are as trappers. The other thing that happens in the trapping for all permitted trappers is they actually have to identify all their traps and snares somehow with something that's personal, like their name or something else, so that what this is a great way of enforcing accountability on the part of the trappers. It also demands that leg hold traps and snares are checked much more frequently than the state regs require. State regs, I think you can go something like 90 days without checking your traps, which is just crazy if you're concerned about either retrieving fur that's in good shape, or if you have non-target species that are caught in there and there's still a chance of letting them out without getting them out of there. Another one, and I'll show you why this is a big deal, is the refuge currently says no traps and snares within 30 feet of any site exposed bait. This is a big deal. I'll show you why shortly. So a couple of photos will really drive it home. This is a big one for local people, is the current furbearer trapping program also says no trapping within a 1 mile buffer of road accessible trailheads, public roads, and public recreational facilities. within the Ski Lake Wildlife Recreation Area and around the refuge headquarters and visitor center up on Ski Hill Road. And this is a big deal. And I'll show you again, I'll show you a photo. And the reason why it's a big deal is lots of people like to recreate with their dogs, whether it's skiing in the winter or just going for a hike. And nobody likes to see their dog caught up in a trap. And then the refuge also has special restrictions on 4 species, which I'll explain why. And then the other big deal is that the refuge also insists on no serrated or toothed leg hold traps. And the reason for that is because if you catch species that you don't mean to catch, for instance, a dog or a moose, you can let them go without necessarily having their leg totally trashed. So I'm going to kind of step through what some of this means. And, you know, again, I said one of the requirements under the current furbearer management program that the refuge has that would go away if the state took over is this required one-time orientation class for all permitted refuge trappers. And the deal here is this is where you learn about what are the regs, what are the ethics, and that is a real photo on the right. I know it looks like it's Photoshop, but that's a domestic cat being used as in a flag set, in a trap, and it's really pretty gross. And the guy I talked to, the law enforcement officer who took the photo of this, he told me he wasn't even sure if the cat was really dead when it was hung or not. So it's a pretty gross thing. Another one is the buffer. The buffer's a big deal. The buffer here, this 1 mile buffer, you can see it here. It shows up on the, it's in purple there. And for those who are local, it affects all along the Funny River Road, goes up Swanson, Swan Lake Road. It's out along the Sterling Highway. It goes down part of the Ski Lake Loop and goes all the way out to Jim's Landing. So it's kind of a big deal. It really, these are all the places where everybody other than trappers access. And of course, the big concern is this, right? This is somebody's dog and it's just off of a trail. And this was a photo from before the permitting program got into place with the conditions that say that you can't do this. This is a real dog caught in a snare. This big deal, this one of the ones here that would go away if the refuge permitting program goes away is no traps within 30 feet of site exposed traps. And the reason why that's a big deal is for aerial predators and scavengers like bald eagles. This is really tempting to come down on the site exposed traps. And this is, again, these are real photos and you know, the obvious question is, should we be killing and trapping things that we don't want to trap on a national wildlife refuge? And even if you can release them alive, you can see on the left, the photo, you know, it basically takes the claws, the talons rather, off of the eagle. And, you know, that eagle can't, even if it's still alive, it can't forage anymore. It's just lost its means for killing animals. This has to do with the frequency with which you check your leg hold trap or snare. And on the refuge, the way it was set up under the permitting program, you have to check it every 4 days if it's in one of our accessible areas. And for those that are local, that's basically Game Management Unit 15A. And if it's remote, you check it once a week. And the whole idea is, if you can check the trap fairly frequently, you'll get a better fur, because your fur won't start rotting if you're doing it for fur reasons. And if you do have a non-target animal, in this case, you probably can't tell what this is, but this is a moose. And this moose died in a snare, and it was a long, horrible death. And, you know, it's just, this shouldn't be happening. It should be happening anywhere, but it definitely should not be happening on a national wildlife refuge. I also mentioned that the refuge has special restrictions for 4 species that would go away if the state regs were in place. And these are all 4 of these species are susceptible to overharvesting by both trapping or gunning for that matter. In the case of lynx, there is a trapping season for lynx, but if you know anything about lynx, the populations follow the snowshoe hare cycle. And so every 10 to 14 years, there's a population high and a population low. And basically what happens is during the low season, the state does close trapping for lynx. But the problem is that there's a lot of trappers that use flag and cubby sets that really attract lynx, and they use it for other fur bearer species like wolverine. So the problem there is that even though the season may be closed for lynx, if you're using certain trap techniques, you are going to catch lynx even when the population's low and even when the season is closed. So what the refuge has done is says, no, you can't use flag and cubby sets during the when the lynx season is closed, and it's just to protect lynx populations during low population numbers. In the case of red fox, it's crazy that we have a red fox season at all on the Kenai Peninsula, let alone the Kenai Refuge. And right now there is no trapping for red fox on the Kenai Refuge. And the reason is because as far as we can tell, there may be no red fox on the Kenai Refuge. In the 17 years I was there, I got no credible report from anyone of red fox, not only on the refuge, but nowhere on the Kenai Peninsula. And I've talked to a number of local ADF&G biologists, Alaska Department of Fish and Game folks, and we just don't have credible information that red fox are anywhere other than maybe the southern end of the peninsula. And so why would you have a season on that? And that's why the refuge has it closed. If we go to the state regs, it'll be open. American marten on the refuge are rare, and they tend to be mostly over in we have a historical source population kind of centered on an area called Surprise Creek on the other side of the Kenai River. And so in our regs, in the refuge regs, it prevents people from trapping east of the Ski Lac Lake area, and that includes the Surprise Creek, and that's basically to protect what we consider to be a source population for the Kenai Refuge, and that would be removed if we eliminated the trapping program. And then the last is beaver, and beaver are pretty low right now in the refuge in general. They've been hit pretty hard, and so there's a number of protective. You can still trap beaver, but there's a couple of specific restrictions to make sure that they aren't over harvested. And one of them specifically is that you can't take more than one beaver per lodge. And if you do take it, you have to somehow flag the lodge so that other trappers know that you've already trapped that area. And that's just to keep from hammering the beaver population. So these are all the things that we would lose if in fact we went to the state regulations, and you can see why the Kenai Refuge wants them. This is how we protect, this is how we do our job, to protect the natural diversity of fish, wildlife, and populations in their natural habitats. So I'm going to stop there. The thing I'm sharing with you here, and I think I'll open it up to have Nikki come in at this point and see if there's questions, but basically, the Department of Interior, and that's the link, is taking public comments until August 10th. So I guess we're talking about almost 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, where you can still do comments. And I'm hoping that you'll use some of the information you learned here to make sure your comments are valuable. So I'll stop here. You want to jump in, Nikki?
Yeah, thank you so much, John. If everyone checks their chat, I put the link to the register comment site, and then I also put a link to a fact sheet that we have on our website that outlines all of the details of the rule, and you can pick and choose and insert facts. Feel free to copy and paste or use whatever you need for your comment, and that's a resource that will be available to you until August 10th. The last time there was the Kenai Rule in 2016, there were, I think, over 70,000 comments, and we're at 14,000 now. So we only have about 20 days. So if you can comment, that's the big thing. Share with others who would be interested in commenting. But I do want to get to questions. We had quite a few throughout the presentation. And John, maybe you could stop sharing screen, or maybe put it on a good picture of the refuge.
There we go.
Or something. I'll go ahead and run through questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat function. So I'll start with this one from Nancy. Why was Kenai Refuge not included in the Obama-era Fish and Wildlife Service refuge rule that was then overturned by the Congressional Review Act in 2017? Going to let John take this one.
Say that again. I'm a little perplexed by that one. Say that again.
Why was Kenai Refuge not included in the Obama-era Fish and Wildlife Service refuge rule that was then overturned by the Congressional Review Act in 2017?
I actually don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I actually wish I had a more senior person here to answer that. I don't know the answer for that.
I don't either. But Nancy will, maybe we can look into that and get back to you. It's a good question. Thanks for putting that forward. This one is from Patricia. She says, will there be a potential for conflict between people riding bicycles on the trails and people using firearms within the area of the Russian River? And it might be
well, the way it's worded now, there are no trails where, well, okay, let me back up. I assume that is she talking about the Lower Russian River Trail? Or is she assuming that there's going to be trails on the refuge side? I'll just answer one or the other. If you know the refuge proposal does not have, it's not opening any areas up towards Upper Russian for biking. But of course, there is current biking on the Forest Service side on the Lower Russian River. You know, going all the way up to Upper Russian River and out to Snug Harbor. And that nothing is real. I don't think anything will seriously change there. I mean, there's always been people out there with firearms. I've often biked up that way, and there's often people carrying large weapons. And
Patricia, I can send a link to the map of the specific trails that would be open to bikes, and then you can take a look and see if you would see conflicts there.
I should. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, we just have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask another one. Are the estimates of brown bear populations on the refuge being used to defend baiting? Is there agreement between the state and the refuge about brown bear populations on the refuge?
Well, I can answer that two ways. So first of all, there's only ever been one rigorous scientific estimate of the Kenai brown bear population ever. And I'm the one that did it with other people in 2010, and that was published in 2015 or 16. I don't even remember anymore. But at that time, we estimated 600 bears. And in late 2014, at the Board of Game, when the Board of Game came up with the current harvest cap, we made it pretty clear based on the data that we had and the models that we had that it said at certain levels we could sustain it at this number that it had been depressed to. You know, we thought we had 600 in 2010, then about 200 bears were killed, almost 250 bears were killed between 2012 and 2014 during very liberalized harvest. And in the aftermath of that, we thought we had maybe 500 bears. Anyway, it's a very long-winded story, but at the end of the day, we think we know how many bears we have on the refuge. And one of the issues we have here is with the baiting open up, is that the harvest will clearly go up. And we do have concerns that it's going to really do another whack on the Kenai brown bear population. And the thing about the brown bear population here is that it is kind of like an island population in that it's on the peninsula. We already know that it's genetically different than brown bear populations on the adjacent mainland, you know, in the Anchorage area. We already know it's different. And so we've already got down to relatively low numbers here for a bear population.
And this is one tacking on to that, will there be a quota on brown bear harvest if baiting is allowed?
That remains to be seen. I mean, obviously there's a harvest cap in place right now that I think is supposed to be revisited this next Board of Game cycle, but a lot of it has to do with the faith you have in the Board of Game process right now. And, you know, I'm going to just say it. I since I don't work for the feds anymore, the current harvest levels, these liberalized harvests, are actually fairly thinly disguised predator control. It is predator control by any other name. And this latest effort to shoot brown bears over bait is really an effort to really knock the brown bear population down even further.
I had a comment from Maggie when you were showing the photos of the eagles who are trapped, and she said that she volunteered at Bird TLC, and any leg injury that they got is usually a euthanasia case. So that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing, Maggie. Another question, are tooth-jawed traps allowed on state land for trapping?
Yes.
Yes. And we have, on that fact sheet, we have some more specifics about what kinds of traps are allowed. Okay, I got another one and I'm finding it now. And this one was about bikes. Sorry, I'm scrolling up. Someone says they have concern that if bikes are allowed on some trails, that this will lead to further opening of other trails in the future. And do you see any issues of potential conflicts between users?
Well, the trails that have been selected, you know, this is one place where the refuge did weigh in a little bit on the DOI package, and the trails that were picked are ones that, I mean, first of all, you know, if you're a user of the trails and you go over to Chugach National Forest or Kenai Fjords and then use what's on the refuge, they're very different trails. I mean, the trails on the refuge are not set up for biking. I mean, and a lot of the smaller trails all just basically go to lakes to go canoeing. And, you know, they've got lots of roots and, you know, lots of alder, and they're not very well cleared. So they're not really conducive for that. Most of the biking that we're talking about is the Marsh Lake Trail, which is a new trail. It's pretty wide open and it goes through the Swan Lake Burn. So it's not the end of the world. And then the other place, the significant one, is the Mystery Creek Road. And truthfully, I've been arguing for that for a long time. I think that's a good place to have bikers. The big deal there, though, is that what's going to happen is if you get that, but you also get removal of the furbearer program, you're going to be able to bike along the road. But if you take your dog, you're going to risk having your dog caught in a trap or a leg hold trap or a snare, because that you're going to get both. It's not one or the other. You're getting both right now. And that's kind of a downside, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're a skier or you're a biker. So, that's a problem. I really do think that I'm glad for the question.
And I'll invite any more last questions while we have John on. And something that I wanted to also note throughout John's presentation, particularly with the trapping regulations, were that the furbearer management plan that came in effect in the late 80s that put these restrictions in place were because of public outcry and conflict between users and issues that the refuge was seeing. These weren't arbitrary decisions. They were made in consultation with local people based on their concerns of dogs being caught in traps, of a lot of roadside trappers that were, you know, leaving traps out, or a lot of bycatch issues. And so the existing permit was designed to mitigate those issues and has been fairly successful in doing so. And not to say that, you know, poaching or illegalities don't happen, but at least there's a mechanism to hold people accountable. And without this trapping permit, all of that would be taken away. So that's a really important piece that helped me orient to this sort of complex issue. Oh, okay. We just got a question about speaking more on the process used in the 80s to develop the furbearer trapping program. Are there documents from that time available to read? So I can pull up that document. It's a great document, the furbearer management plan. It has some interesting history. But John, while I'm doing that, will you speak to that process?
Yeah, I wasn't working for the refuge at the time, so I've only heard bits and pieces of it. But it was very contentious, lots of involvement, and like I say, it ended up in the 1988 Furbearer Management Plan. And my predecessor, a guy named Ted Bailey, who's actually he's actually a cat biologist. He did his research on leopards in Africa, so when he was tasked with this is of course back in the 80s, he was tasked with figuring out what are the best practices for land management units for basically putting safeguards into place. And he's the one who worked very hard to come up with all of these different conditions that the refuge puts on permitted trappers. And the truth of the matter is, some of your best trappers, the ones who are actually, out of a group of 50 or 60 people who are actually trapping on the refuge, most of your fur bearers are actually being taken by 2 or 3 or 4 individuals who happen to be very good. And the really good committed trappers, a lot of the they actually agree with a lot of these restrictions because it makes it nicer for them. It's a way of spacing out trappers and making sure that everybody's not clustering and stepping on each other. And because all of the traps and snares have identification on them, everybody knows who's who, and they don't mind it. It's really the weekend, I'll call them weekend warriors, and there might be a better name for that, but basically it's the guys who just want to go out and do a little bit of recreational trapping. And those are often the ones that get sloppy because they'll put out traps and, maybe they got to go to work on the slope or something and they forget to check their traps before they leave, and the traps sit out there for, a few weeks while they're up north. And it's that kind of thing that we're trying to prevent. And I agree with you totally, Nikki, that what I've heard is that you take away all of these insurances that are put into place, we're basically shoving the clock back to, the 80s, and nothing will change, right? It'll be back to where we were back in square one.
Yeah. Great. Are there any other questions that we have? I was going to share some photos of some additional photos, but I think we're out of time. Again, I just really encourage everyone to comment on the rule again before August 10th. And all of that information is on our website. It's in the chat function. And one thing that would be helpful for us too is to, if you want to send comments on the Wildlife Wednesday itself, if this time works, if this format works, things that you'd like to see, it's your time to thank John for donating his time. This was all volunteer based. He's been doing a lot on this issue. But really the best thing you can do if you would like to see these practices staying out of the refuge or the parts of the rule that you like is to comment and to encourage other people to comment before August 10th.
Yeah, and I'll even say that one of the comments you might consider, Alaska Wildlife Alliance and the Friends of Alaska Refuges and other groups are doing these kinds of outreach, and that's because the refuge is not being allowed to do public meetings on this. And that would be normal practice, is when you propose a new regulatory package, typically you would have a public open house or a public meeting to kind of let people understand what's happening. And so this is a very atypical process where you're given 2 months to comment, but we're not going to tell you what it's about. So that alone is a comment to make that the process is a little bit, it's not as transparent as it could be.
Yeah, this is great. We had a question if they're going to excuse this or potentially extend this because of COVID as comment period.
I doubt it very much. I think this is all being fast tracked. And with that said, I should say that the litigation is also continuing too on the side. So this is the comment for the period for the proposed rule, but there still is litigation going on elsewhere. So that's happening at in a different place.
Yes, and that's a whole other aspect of it. There is continuing litigation, and AWA is an intervener along with many other organizations, allied organizations who are on this call, so thank you. And if you wanted to support that effort, you can become a member of Alaska Wildlife Alliance, any groups in those in that coalition, and comment. That gives everyone involved the ammunition they need to fight back. So I also wanted to, in these chat functions, I'm getting a lot of kudos. Thank you for doing this. I'm never missing another Wednesday. So thank you, John. Learned a lot. If you want to just also say where you're calling in from, it's fun for us to know where this reached. This is very informative and helpful in understanding the history, proposed regs, and possible impact. Thanks for your time. We have people in Anchorage, San Francisco. One person says in the early 80s, AWA was instrumental in stopping ADF&G from aerial shooting wolves and eliminating entire packs on the refuge, whose pelt values were reduced by lice carried by domestic canines. So thanks, yes, we've been in this for a long time. And that's Wayne, yeah, Wayne Hall, a long time AWA founder, actually, so.
That is a big deal.
I feel great to have him here. Thanks for joining, Wayne. Okay, well, I'm going to release John for the evening. Thank you all. We have some people from the North Slope. So keep having the chats in. I'll share them with John, and I'll stay on the call for a little while longer. But thank you, everyone, and please comment. Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
Great, thanks, Maggie. Good to see you all. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks, Mandy. Thank you, Wayne, for commenting. Please let me know if you need anything more. We have a bunch of information, fact sheets, some blogs, happy to share any of that. And we have a lot of other people on the call too. So in this coalition, it's been a really good group. So thank you. Thanks, Bob, so much for joining in Eagle River. Go enjoy the last bits of sunshine we have for today. Thanks so much. Thanks, Wayne. And I see Poppy and Pauline. Thanks for joining tonight. Both doing so much for wildlife in the state. Oh, and David too. Thanks, David. And Hank, I'm not sure I know you, but thank you so much for joining. It's nice to see new faces. Or new to me faces. All right, for the last remaining folks, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.